Well, thank you to Ralph for that incredible welcome, and to the entire 2,500 of you who are tuning in. Welcome once again. And of course, we are hearing everything and reading everything that you have to say. Thank you so much for your engagement. That was Ralph Fletcher, the CEO of Topco Media, officially welcoming us into day 2 of the Future of HR Virtual Summit, all the way in Cape Town. We now get ready for a fireside chat, and we'll be focusing particularly on the 2021 HR tech trends, as well as the digital future on the work of journey. And I'm joined by an esteemed panelist, 2 panelists who are no stranger to enhancing performance management, as well as creating effective strategies on the future when we are making these future of work, rather data-driven decisions. Now, day 1 of the Future of HR Summit, we really focused on giving us a glimpse into some of the questions that needed to be asked to produce some of these cutting HR innovation strategies, to the case studies, the keynote addresses, some of the panel discussions as well. And we also heard from our finalists in terms of what are the things that they are doing to really engage in the future of work, the technologies, the strategies. We heard also some incredible numbers that were coming through when we were speaking to diversity, inclusion, as well as equity. Welcome to the fireside chat, our opening fireside chat, themed 2021 HR tech trends and the digital future of the work journey. Now, this discussion is themed on the essentialism of HR technology, really unpacking some of the things like automating tasks, as well as the impact that this is having on traditional workplace structure. We also will be speaking to our panelists and getting some ideas on really how to make the hybrid remote work model work for your team as we are navigating the newfound flexibility at work. My name is Vuyolwethu Dubese, your moderator for this panel discussion, and it is an absolute pleasure to welcome my panelists. We have Oran Cohen, who's the founder and CEO of gwork.io, as well as Mark Privet, who of course you heard from yesterday, the general manager at Careers 24 and Simplify HR at Media 24. Gentlemen, welcome to the fireside chat, and thank you so very much for joining us. And let me get straight into it. Oran, let me kickstart this conversation with you. Your company really works to integrate people and technology in this new way of work and in this new work when we are engaging in organizations, largely consulting with people and business processes and how we're designing and driving behavioral capability to really talk to what has been the theme of today, and has been the theme of yesterday as well, to scale the future of work. What exactly does this mean? Because this echoes for me the sum of human-centered design plus technology, as well as the open-mindedness that we need to engage in and not act with yesterday's logic.
Fantastic. Such a pleasure to be here this morning with you. That's a great question. So our focus at gwork and how gwork was born is we've worked with organizations like Google, Nestle. We've worked with most of the banks locally across Africa and even in the US. And the number one challenge that organizations are trying to solve, and one of the trends that is playing out at the moment, is moving from the solutioning of a piece of the puzzle to really HR owning business transformation. And that challenge poses a whole new adventure for where HR leaders are trying to go. Gone are the days where we're looking at things at piecemeal. You know, in the old world, we were doing performance management over there and learning development over here and engagement surveys over there. The challenge is that another key trend is that we need to move from data accessibility to data literacy, and then even evolve to data transformation. In other words, What does it mean? Why does it mean that? And what can we do about it? And so organizations need to realize that they need to build golden threads between performance, culture, behaviors, learning and development, and process improvement into a single value chain to transform the organization. This is what we focus on at G-Work. So it's about unlocking the potential of your people and enabling them through a people-centric approach to unlock the value of the organization around process, improvement of our ways of working, etc.
Absolutely. And I echo your point around, the single value chain, which is something that has become so critical, because what is very clear is that fundamentally the redundancy of human resources in that function is becoming very clear, because we also will be hearing from a speaker later on who has transitioned from just being an HR manager to being a specialist in organizational development. So clearly your point around, just working on a piece of the problem and really just wanting to own digital transformation is becoming something that's very important. Mark, I want to move to you and really this golden thread that Aran is speaking to, because in your address on day one at the summit, you put forth some big questions that needed to be answered, and I'm going to throw the pendulum back to you on some of these questions, because as we're talking about this single value chain, starting with digital transformation in recruitment and in the space, it can be very daunting. How do we assist our teams, who have taken on a lot more than just recruitment? As Oran was saying, that, it's about owning the entire piece. It's about being a part of, the value chain that we're engaging in, and not just recruitment. So how do we support them in handling these changes made to the traditional workplace structure? And before that even, are they ready, and are we ready for this leap, and particularly within the context of South Africa and Southern Africa?
It's a very good question. Thanks very much, Vuyo. I think it's a multi-layered question, and I really appreciate it. But I think the one thing that is very clear is, I think when we speak about change or transformation, whether it be in recruitment specifically or across the HR function or across the organization as a whole, we've always got to start with what are we trying to achieve and why. And I think if we always start with that perspective, with that lens, then it becomes a lot easier to drive it through the organization. Technology for technology's sake doesn't work. You need to be asking very specific questions. Are you looking at adopting technology for savings? Is it for productivity? Is it for whatever the case may be, whatever it is that you're trying to solve within your organization? The technology needs to match that, but also the way that you work and the way that you measure has to measure that, has to follow suit. We've seen that adoption works really well when there are KPIs in place, when there are benchmarks in place, when it is measured on a regular basis, and that's when adoption really takes off. We often find, and unfortunately this is the case in some of the organizations that we work with and that we've engaged with, is that sometimes a slab of technology gets thrown down. It's decided on a C-suite level, or the HR director says, I want this, but the reason why, what the benefits are, how it's going to change the organization, and what positive impact it could potentially bring is not communicated through to the teams that will be working on these sort of platforms, and that's where sometimes the mismatch is. So it's really imperative that change management is a key component of whatever adoption that you do take in your technology strategy when it comes to HR.
Absolutely.
Can I add to that?
I was just about to throw the very same question to you, Oran, in that, our readiness for this pandemic-proof HR strategies. Are we ready for that leap?
I want to add to what Mark said, because I think it's such an important point that can go unnoticed. And that point is this, is that products HR products are going to be ubiquitous. It's going to be inevitable that HR is moving from a service to a product, to a platform. What organizations need to focus on is we need to learn how to integrate a product into our strategies, so that you don't just land a commodity in the organization. It speaks to the why, Mark, that you're bringing up. It connects to what are we trying to achieve in our organization. So leaders have to move away from going, oh, this is a nice feature, oh, this is a piece that we need, and understand its context in order to achieve an overall strategy. And so we help organizations do that with how we roll out G-Work. But what's important is we're seeing that the organizations who are succeeding around business transformation, and that's the new mandate of HR, right? Transform your organization through your people. We're seeing that the organizations who do this really well have thought through a strategy, a systemic, holistic strategy that then gets operationalized. Where organizations go really wrong is that they start with the tool in mind, and then they evolve their strategy to meet that need. Now, there's value in that because you're learning from what you're interacting with in the market, which is fantastic. But at some point, you have to get clear about what you're trying to achieve, and then you have to think about how do you implement and operationalize your strategy with technology. Let's face it, your competitors are buying the same technology you are. So if you want to differentiate yourself, you need to understand how you're going to leverage who you are, your differentiator, your culture, your way of working as a core competitive advantage to win over your competition.
Oran, I want to stick with what you're saying, and I want to bring some of these examples that you're talking about to life, because we're constantly seeing research on how organizations that use these HR software outperform those who don't, and of course those who know how to use it, and to Mark's point as well, who know why they're doing it, right? And are setting the value indexes, the KPIs that should correspond to these strategies of transformation. Recently, we had Sage also share a case study on new research information on 1,000 businesses that they engaged with across South Africa. What success stories, and perhaps to the work even of G-Work, that are important to acknowledge in this regard, and what can we learn from them?
Absolutely. I think that the big transformation is how does HR get a seat at the table when it comes to strategy and operations? And how do those stakeholders come together? So from our case studies, what we're seeing is the organizations that are able to not only operate from their intention, but understand their colleagues' intentions and link that again to strategy and operate in that way. So how does HR transform and enable operations? How does operations enable and transform HR? How does that connect to customer satisfaction and customer experience? How do you design employee experience that has a direct impact on customer experience? These are the types of things that are crucial to enable. So I recall one organization that we were working with, they felt that they had an operational issue. And the operational issue was playing out in the context of the gossip mill was where everything was discussed. There was no direct feedback. That was not channeled in any way to take action. And that was literally, I like to call that almost like a metaphor of Goliath, a huge giant who's moving towards somewhere, and these tiny little dwarfs and strings all over them, stopping them. And that culture is this way. So what we found is that when we enabled people with an avenue of expression, where, for example, in our system, you're able to highlight business insights, what's stopping you from doing genius work or doing great work, and then theming that on behalf of the organization. When we did that, the organization itself transformed into a more efficient way of working, because the gossip mill was not the only place where people were expressing what's not working and how it could improve, but that started to get officialized. And so organizations have to understand, how do they go about linking their people capability, and there's a reason we call it capital or resource, in order to leverage the exponential improvement of the organization itself.
It seems as though the task for human resources is big, and the triggers and the considerations for indicators like technology, like the pandemic, and the long-term effects of such has really called upon human resources to perhaps re-look and rethink the design of their function, because it's not only just about the recruitment as we've outlined, but there's the change management, there's the strategies, there's this performance that they need to take into consideration, put their finger on the pulse on the many other units of the business. Because to your point, it's really about turning this product of a hire and how they can be a part of the strategy of the company. And Mark, as with all these changes and automation and upgrades that are taking place, how can HR leaders go about building this golden thread that we're talking about, or this sense of continuity throughout the organization? Because it does seem that, community, culture is something that's being brought forth, and it's very clear that you cannot do it alone.
Absolutely. It's the golden thread is such an interesting concept, in that what we see with the HR function is often it's very split. It's, you have specializations within the HR function. So, for example, you'll have talent acquisition specialists, or you would have remuneration specialists particularly in larger organizations. And I think what we need to do is we need to have a holistic view of an employee. That is the one thing that we need to look at, and we need to identify how it is that we want this employee to behave, and how do we want to behave as an organization towards this employee to build a better culture, to build a productive organization. And if you always have that lens on, I think it becomes a lot easier when you have discussions across these cross functions within HR. I think it's important to always speak the same language, to understand what is it that you would like to achieve as an HR department or as an HR function as a whole, not only as the function within in the department. And of course, this comes back to the strategy that Oran was talking about. I think if you don't start with the strategy and you don't instill the vision of that strategy across the HR function, you will get these pockets of different ways of working, different ways of doing things. And going back to the tools, I think you need to have some form of unified tool or tool set. And not all tools, I don't think there's not many cases where you get a single tool set that works for an organization. But what works really well is you have a set of tools that speak to each other, that say for example, Simplify.hr, you want to now onboard a candidate, that it speaks into your payroll system, and it speaks into your onboarding system, and it speaks into your learning and development platforms, and your remuneration and whatever the case may be. So I think that's also quite an important component, because sometimes you drop the balls between the systems that speak to each other.
Absolutely. And as you're talking about things that work and things that work well, and you bringing Simplify HR into this conversation, the sense of community, networking, collaboration seems to be at the center of many of the conversations that are happening at the summit. Is this what, Simplify HR is investing in gleaning such insights, in gleaning this networking, perhaps even this collaboration and this conversation between you and Oran, in terms of, harnessing and looking to the future with these very leaders who are also thinking about this cutting edge technology or cutting edge innovation when it comes to the industry?
Absolutely. And this is why I love these events, because it really gives us a view into expertise and forward thinking that other vendors are doing, other other vendors that are trying to find new solutions to existing problems and to problems that we didn't even know that we had. We are not looking at solving every single HR problem because we focus on a very specific area. But what we do look at is we look at complementary services that make sense. I'll give you an example. So when you are going through the recruitment process, there are a couple of things that you need to do. So, for example, evaluate a candidate. We have partnered with video interview providers that you can plug into the Simplify platform, and you can do asynchronous video interviewing. So you don't have to have these long face-to-face interviews with every single potential candidate you want to look for. We don't provide that service necessarily ourselves. We don't own it, but it is plugged into our system. It's the same thing for background checks and assessments and those type of tools. We don't specialize in that, but there are organizations that are very well known and specialize in that, but we just make sure that it's plugged into the workflow of a recruiter when they are going through that hiring process.
And this question, I think, for both of you, as this is, the headline of this fireside chat, what are perhaps, if you can identify 3 of the 2021 HR tech trends, for lack of a better term, that have impacted the future of the work journey, and perhaps one in 2022 and beyond that you are already getting excited about the effectual impact that it'll have in industry. Oran, let me throw it back to you, and then I'll hand over the digital mic back to Mark.
Sure, absolutely. So the first one is you're starting to track and build data around the hard things, the hard facts, right? So, for example, you're starting to track and understand leave. You're starting to understand high potential individuals based on performance. You're starting to understand the basics, which is fantastic. You're starting to analyze that information. There's a whole body of work that is at the core of how you work that enables or disables the organization. And that's how performance, culture, learning, and process improvement come together in order to enable the organization. So find ways to measure culture. Find ways to measure improvement of how people are showing up when they get feedback, because then you can start to manage retention better. You can understand what are the levers that you can pull to really create an exponential organization. The next one is for the HR leader, and this is a plea. How do you move out of being a solution provider and become a source of business transformation? How do you own a piece of business transformation in the organization? And then lastly, I'd like to suggest that organizations need to start to become better at scenario planning. What does that mean? Is that right now we live in a time where your workforce in 6 weeks' time might be back at home, or it might be fully blown in the office, or it might be hybrid. Each one has pros and cons, and we need to start to build better data sets and interpret those and take them to leadership to be part of the decision making, and then roll out strategies that enable both plan A, B, and C.
Absolutely. And perhaps one for 2022 that's really emerging is the data and making these data-driven decisions. And this loop of creating, a monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. I always say meal is the delicious part of the business. And I think it's so important as we are, to your point, measuring the culture, measuring the improvement, so that we can get better at making these data-driven decisions. Mark, the very same question to you, the trends that you've been seeing for 2021, and something that you're already seeing in motion and you are hopeful for, that we will have made perhaps better conversations for 2022 at the summit.
Yeah, I think I'm not going to speak about the trends in terms of the technology, but actually the problems that we are seeing facing organizations. And I think the first one is that we're starting to look at employees with a holistic view, not just the employees as they are 8 to 5 while they're working in the office, but we're looking at all aspects, because I think the blurring of work and home while we work from home in these sort of blended environments is tricky. And it's obviously, when we look at mental health, it's one of the issues that we are seeing a lot more within organizations as we have burnout, as we have people unable to switch off, and as this technology the positive impacts of technology also bring negative impacts. I think people aren't able to switch off, for example. Being able to answer emails at 9 o'clock at night when you should be spending time with your family. I mean, that's just become a reality. So I think there will be a lot more focus on that employee wellness in the context of working from home. The second thing I would say is that what we're realizing that historically we had a one-size-fits-all view of what an employee is. You come to the office at 8 and you leave at 5. You work your 9 hours a day with a 1 hour break. Now, we can see in our organization. So the market dictates that different areas of the business will behave differently. For example, tech and dev staff will probably work differently past the pandemic than some other people in the organization. Of course, this will be driven by organizational requirements, but also the requirements of our employees, of our staff. They're going to be driving how they would like to work. And part of this is driven by scarcity. So when you're a scarce skill, you have the power to dictate a little bit of, I'd like to work from home. I'd like to have the flexibility. So I think that's definitely a trend that we're seeing, is that this concept of one size fits all for everybody in the workplace will be challenged a little bit. And it's going to take a lot of creativity to be able to build a workplace of the future. Office space, remuneration, all these type of things you've got to take into consideration. And I think that will be the one thing. But the one trend that I'd really like to touch on, and it's not really a trend, but it's just a reality, is that legislation as a whole is playing a big part in how HR teams function. So if I look at the POPI laws that have just been introduced recently, it's taken a massive tax, a massive burden on the HR teams to have to be ready for the laws and make sure that they are compliant with the laws. Things like accepting a CV at the reception, or somebody can drop a CV, is just no longer acceptable. You have to have consent. You have to have a strategy on deletion of data. Those type of things is something that 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago you weren't considering as an HR professional. So you have to keep abreast of legislation and what legal requirements you do have as an organization.
And what about compensation? Because I think, it's slightly crept up in day one of the summit, but how will that influence it? And I see, Oran, I'm going to start with you because I saw that smile creep up as I was bringing up the term. But that is something that we're seeing we're seeing countries experimenting with compensation. And how can HR leaders be a part of that conversation? How do they rethink whether it's going fully remote, the hybrid model of working, or even maybe cutting salaries, which is what we're seeing quite a few companies experimenting with?
Such a wonder. I mean, we can spend half an hour just on this topic. I recently actually just wrote an article called Cash No Longer King. And one of the challenges that we're seeing is, of course, we've heard about this trend around the Great Resignation, where because of the pandemic, people feel inspired to take life into their own hands. And that means their own time, their own, to become self-employed, or to become contractors. This is fundamentally changing the terrain. And what we're finding is that it's harder to hire and it's harder to retain staff for longer. And when I want to say staff, I also want to say quality staff, because we live in a knowledge-based society more and more, where we can't have people not be thinking for a living. So when we talk about these thinkers, or these knowledge workers in a sense, the big shift needs to be, how do you create a plan for these individuals that is long-term, that And this is where that human-centric design thinking, employee value proposition piece comes in critically. Because if you are a rocket ship right now, and you're growing at the speed of knots as a scale-up in South Africa, your core challenge is finding and keeping quality staff. And so this is more important to figure out than remuneration. Again, in isolation, you need to understand that remuneration is rewards and recognition. Remuneration is development, the desire for autonomy and mastery. How do you embed that in your developmental journeys? How do you run your one-on-ones? We have to get quite operational in order to achieve our strategic objectives. So I'm answering the question with a bit of a spin to say we need to revision what remuneration means. Yes, we have to pay good salaries, but some organizations have to find more creative ways to remunerate in order to create that retention that they're after.
Absolutely. And I think yesterday we also heard from Old Mutual with their On Their Money program, embedding the reward of financial well-being by taking, hold of and owning the financial education that needs to be implemented. Mark, is cash no longer king?
I think it's still a very big component. Let's be honest. It is still a very big component. It is still a draw card for many of our employees when they get big offers of double-digit growth or whatever the case may be. They consider it, right? But to Oran's point, I think there's more to it than what meets the eye. Yes, we see it all the time. We have what we call a merry-go-round in our organization, our larger organization, where people leave for money, but they come back for culture. They come back for the way we work, the way the way we operate, the transparency. So there are other things at play, but you can't have the other things at play without having the basics right. So if you're paying under market related, no matter what sort of schemes you have in place, no matter how happy your organization is, people still need to live. They want a quality of life that matches their skill set and that of their peers. So I think there's a base need, but I think there are ways that you can be creative in offering other incentives to remain in an organization.
Absolutely. And I think that really speaks to the positioning of the value add that companies are now really are having to rethink beyond just the cash, beyond just the money that they leave for. And as to your point, Mark, coming back for that culture, coming back for that value add. And gentlemen, as we invite your closing remarks to this conversation, what advice would you give to organizations who are struggling to embrace new HR tech trends and the digital future of work? Mark, let me swing the pendulum back to you, and Oren, I'll let you close us out.
Thanks so much. It's been such an interesting conversation. I think for me, it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning. I think before you adopt the technology, you need to know why you want to adopt the technology. Understand what your pain points are in your business. Understand what you would like to improve on or that you feel is a burning platform. And in doing that, you will really understand what you want to adopt and have a 1 year, 3 year, 5 year plan and measure it, revisit it, and make sure that you can deliver it through the organization by getting buy-in from everybody within the organization that is a touch point in that process.
Absolutely. Measure it, revisit it, and know why you are adopting that technology. Oran?
I think organizations need to think about how do they close feedback loops. So the research shows us that effective and successful organizations have fast feedback loops. In other words, you know what action, what the repercussions of an action is very quickly. And that's with regards to HR, operations, strategy, customer success, whatever it is. And so organizations need to actually map out where the broken feedback loops are and how they can go about filling data, meaning, and action within them. Similarly, I would recommend that we take time to map what data we have and what data we want, and back to Mark's question of why. What are we trying to achieve with that data? We're finding ourselves in a world where we have too much data and not enough meaning. So the more we can get clear on our why, as Mark has shared so beautifully, the more we can utilize what we have and understand what we need next.
Absolutely. And I think a brilliant way to round up this incredible discussions. A huge thank you to my panelist, Oran Cohen, the founder and CEO of gwork.io, and Mark Privet, the general manager of Careers 24 and Simplify HR at Media 24, for this invigorating discussion that invites us to be critical in our thinking, cutting edge in our design, and definitely bold in our actions as we nurture this new way of work. Well, we now continue to our keynote address, which has your answers to the temporary employer and employee scheme, including insights on new policies in light of COVID-19 to fair retrenchment. Please welcome Cameron Silo Murajane, the Director and CEO at the CCMA.